Thank you, everybody, and very warm welcome to our first webinar of 2023, What's Next for Israel, Making Sense of the New Israeli Government. I'm going to hand over now to our national chairman of the South African Zionist Federation, Mr. Rowan Polovin, for some introductions.
Thank you very much. A very good evening to all of you, Erev Tov, and welcome to this important event tonight that is proudly brought to you by the South African Zionist Federation, the bridge between our community and Israel. We are celebrating a very special year this year at the South African Zionist Federation. It is the 125th anniversary of our organization, and Stacey Denbo, our executive director, later on this evening will tell you about some exciting events that are coming forward this year. So without much further ado, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy this important discussion and deliberation this evening, and I'll hand you over to our esteemed host, Howard Feldman. Howard.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Rowan, for the introduction. I find it quite interesting that we are sitting here in South Africa, and I'm hoping my inverter lasts until load shedding ends and the lights come back on. But just for a moment, we could look a little bit further afield and look at Israel and say, gosh, what's only going on there? So maybe every now and then it's a fun thing to do.
We have electricity and water, and you have a
Right.
Constitution. So
Right,
we each have
exactly.
pros and cons.
And right now, I would take electricity and water over a constitution, but no, I'm not sure if I would. So Lahav, good evening. You are, of course, the political correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. You and I have spoken many, many times, and especially on this issue, because it is a very complex one. The South African Jewish community very reticent generally about being critical of Israel, but now we're a bit nervous because some of our favorite commentators and the people that we always rely on to defend Israel are saying things that are making us nervous. So here we are, a very strongly Zionistic community, quite unnerved and maybe a little bit unsettled by what is going on in Israel. So to begin, can I ask you just to give us a little bit of context?
Yeah, I think that this issue is being unfairly framed as, Democrats versus fascists or anti-Democrats. And I just don't think that's the case at all. I think that there are two intellectual schools when it comes to the role of the judiciary in Israel that have been around for decades, but have become more popular politically since 2009, 2010, more or less, when there were a few Knesset members in Likud who really took it on. And I won't deny that the judicial reform has become sort of a populist cause in the sense that the far right has taken it on, and some have behaved as though this is going to affect Netanyahu's corruption case, and that they support it because they love Netanyahu. But when you get down to it, it's not. These are two legitimate and long-standing schools of thought about the judiciary. Now, one school of thought is for activism, judicial activism. The other is not for judicial activism. And just to rewind all the way back so people understand what they mean by that. So Israel doesn't have a constitution. It's based to a certain extent on the British system. They don't have a constitution either. Of course, they have the Magna Carta. They have a legal tradition that goes back centuries, and we also have a legal system that goes back millennia, but that's not what our courts use. Our courts use a legal system that started 75 years ago, and in theory, when Israel was formed, there was something called basic laws, which were sort of laws that were supposed to be the building blocks to an eventual constitution. And in the beginning, they consisted of things of sort of what the Knesset does, what does the president do, how do elections work. In the early 1990s, the Knesset passed two laws that pertain to civil and individual rights in Israel. And the court decided to use those. And so even though it doesn't say anywhere in the law that basic laws are somehow superior to other laws, that, that was not what was meant by them being the building blocks of an eventual constitution. The court decided that if new laws are passed that the court views as contradicting these civil or individual rights laws, that they could strike those laws down. And the court took on this authority slowly at first. And in the past 15 years or so, it started striking down laws a lot more often than it used to. So it started to be a lot less sort of cautious about this. In addition, there's something that started even before the what was called the constitutional revolution, when those two laws were passed, which is that the court started judging government policies by whether the court decided they were reasonable or not. So first of all, it didn't necessarily have to be a law. It could be, you know,
and I'm sorry, how did
passed.
What was the basis of reasonableness?
That's the question, right? So it's not based on what's written in the law. It's based on what the judges view as reasonable.
On what a group of judges decided is reasonable.
Yeah. And so this is something that also that people who oppose judicial activism really oppose. Then you have the people who support judicial activism who say that maybe there's not strong enough legal protections for minorities in Israel, or maybe it's just in Israel, the coalition, as opposed to the opposition, is very, very powerful. The opposition has very little power to change things. And so, you know, some people who support judicial activism say, well, that's, you know, very, very strong system of checks and balances is important on the politicians. So this argument has been going on for a really long time. It's been going on, you know, there have been a few justice ministers that were not right-wing, not from the Likud, who thought that the courts need to be put more in check. One was Chaim Ramon from the Labor Party. One was Daniel Friedman, who was from Kadima. Technically, I think he wasn't from any party because he was a professional appointment, unlike most ministers in Israel, but he was appointed by Kadima. And on the other hand, there have been some people in Likud who really oppose judicial reform, although they're sort of former Likud people, like Mary Dor, who was a justice minister from Likud. So it doesn't.
There. How is the Supreme Court constituted?
Okay, so the Supreme Court justices in Israel are chosen by a committee that's called the Judicial Selection Committee, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me at the moment, but it's made up of you have 2 ministers, and then you have 2 Knesset members. Usually there's one from the opposition, one from the coalition, but there's no law requiring it. So there have been times where people broke with custom. And then the rest of the committee, and I believe that there's not 11 people on the committee, but I'm not certain about it. But the majority of the committee is made up from people in the legal profession, Supreme Court justices and members of the Bar Association. And usually the members of the Bar Association are in the Supreme Court's pocket because they want to become judges one day too. And,
in other words, it becomes self-fulfilling.
Correct.
Judges, however the Supreme Court is how it continues to be because of how the appointment process works.
Yes. So the Supreme Court controls the majority of the committee, and therefore, when you have a lot of activist judges, they are likely to choose other activist judges who support their same sort of philosophy of the judiciary. There was a change, a bit of a change between 2015 and 2019 when Ayelet Shaked, who's no longer in politics, but she's from the right, she sort of struck a deal with the head of the Bar Association, who was also more conservative, and they worked together to appoint more conservative judges. So the Supreme Court justices on the committee didn't have control. But that's very rare. That almost never happens. And so it was essentially a situation where the judges were appointing their own replacements, and the vast majority of the judges were, like I said, they were for judicial activism. So now this judicial reform wants to make a few changes. First of all, they want to change the makeup of the committee to make it more political. And you know, they want to have, instead of the Bar Association representatives, they want to have representatives of the public, which would be appointed by politicians. And then the other thing they want to get rid of the reasonableness way of judging things entirely. And they also want to do something that's called the override clause. Now, this is something that that actually first came from Canada in the 1970s. Canada passed some kind of human rights law. It was when Pierre Trudeau was prime minister, so the previous prime minister Trudeau. They passed some kind of human rights law, and some of the provinces said that they conflict with things that are important to them. And so they passed this law in Canada where the provinces or one houses of the parliament that's like represented by province, something like that, can vote to temporarily override a Supreme Court ruling. And back in the 1990s, when Israel had passed those civil rights laws that I had talked about, one of the things was freedom of occupation, and I don't mean occupation like what people claim is in the West Bank. I mean like what your job is. And but that's the best translation of it, even though it's a loaded word. So some kibbutzniks wanted to raise pigs in Israel, and Shas, which is a party, they were very upset by that, and they were considering even leaving the coalition over it, bringing down the government. And this was in the Oslo days, so it would have been a big disruption to the Oslo Accords as well. And Aaron Barak, who was eventual president of the Supreme Court and really the like father of judicial activism, he suggested that they write into the freedom of occupation law an override clause like they have in Canada. So it was a limited override clause that applied only to that. And so then for the time being, people couldn't raise pigs in Israel. Today, the coalition in its judicial reform wants an override clause that would apply to any law that the Supreme Court strikes down. And they want it to be a 61-seat majority, which means that as long as you have a cooperative coalition, you will always be able to override these kinds of rulings by the Supreme Court. So part of the argument.
So what you're saying is that there are three main
there
areas.
are other elements.
Right.
There
but
are
these are
other
the three main areas. Yeah. Okay. And is there an acceptance, or is, you know, across the board?
I'm losing you, Howard. I can't understand what you're saying. Is it just me, or can other people hear him?
He is breaking up a little bit, Lahav. Let's give him a second. The power's just come back on. We'll catch up now.
Okay.
That some reform is needed.
Sorry, Howard, I just need to interrupt you there.
Because the electricity is just
back,
so it just gets a bit wobbly
just start
for a
that question
second.
again, please. Sure.
All right, let's just see. All right, just let me know if you can hear me now. All right.
Yes, I do. Now we don't see you, but hopefully that'll just come back.
If need be, I'll just change. All right, but am I back? You can hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
Or not? Lahav, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you, but I think you don't hear me.
Sorry about this, folks. Howard's load shedding has just come back on, and I think he just needs to reconnect. He's going to rejoin the meeting now, and that should sort things out. Thanks, Lahav.
All right, apologies for that. Am I back with you?
I see and hear you. You hear me?
Okay, fantastic. Apologies for that. So in other words, in terms of the Israeli public, is there an acceptance that some reform is required?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty broad consensus that some reform is required. But some of it has to do with the nature. Some of it has to do with like people who just think that the current reform being proposed goes too far. For example, the override clause, it's too easy to override laws. Or that the judicial selection committee would be too political. And the thing that some people have been saying, people sort of in the center here have been saying, is that there needs to be a course correction, but that you can't replace one injustice with another injustice, is the argument that they're making. That if you're saying the judges have too much influence, well, now you're just giving all the power to the politicians.
Which is a concern, because politicians do need to be checked, don't they?
Yeah, I think so too. I think, but I also think, well, let me get back to your question, and then I'll say what I think is really going on here with the bill itself. So the problem with politics is that even our centrists in Israel, they tend to speak in an extreme way. So even though if you look at past things Yair Lapid said, he's not a critic of the court, but he sort of admitted or was willing to, say that some sort of reform is needed. But now he's like furious, and he's the head of the opposition, and he's always disliked Netanyahu, and so he feels like he can't even say something like that. Benny Gantz, who is, people like him a lot because he's really like not a politician in the way he conducts himself. I think that's and so I think that's one of the things people like about him. And he's, whatever, for better or for worse, right? Like he has he does have great political skill, but he also has been able to admit that, we should do this, and actually we should probably work together with the coalition on it so we can have an influence. And then suddenly everyone in opposition was really mad at him, right? So I do think that both sides will hopefully have to sort of come down and find a way to meet in the middle. Like, I think that on
so why is there why is there this incredible amount of anger or fear where you've got 100,000 people, surely I would imagine with something better to do on a Saturday night than taking to the streets in Tel Aviv?
So, I think that a lot of people have forgotten that like a year and a half ago, before we had the Naftali Bennett Yair Lapid government, that there were thousands of people, and even sometimes tens of thousands of people, protesting outside the prime minister's residence every single Saturday night against Netanyahu. So first of all, like, I think that this is, in some ways, this is the new version of that. However, they have found something to latch onto, because I think that there are real concerns about this judicial reform. It's gone, it does take things pretty far. I think, there's an expression in Israel when you pass a law that there are goats in the law. Now, why they call it goats? There's like that famous Hasidic story about the man who was very poor and his house was too small. He had a lot of kids in the house. He complained to the rabbi, and the rabbi told him to bring animals into the house. Right. Bring the cow in, bring the goat in. And once you take them out, suddenly the house felt really big, even though it was the same house, the same amount of people all along. So when you have a big, thick law in Israel, there are goats in it that are things that are a little bit more extreme, or that, they're not even really trying to pass, or they don't really think could pass, but they put it in there so that when you take them out, the law that the proposers actually wanted will pass. Our justice minister in Israel, Yariv Levin, has been a major critic of the judiciary for a very long time, before it was popular, let's say. But I still think he wrote what would be like his dream reform, and not what he actually thinks could happen in the end, because he knows there'll be pushback. So when you meet in the middle, it'll still be closer to what he actually likes. That's my theory of what's going on here on the right. And on the left, I think a lot of it has to do with just, this is something that they've found that they could sort of get momentum with. There are other things too. I mean, there's elements of this government that are sort of openly homophobic, have openly said all kinds of anti-gay things. But I think that this is something that is not as much of a classically like left-right issue, even though gay rights have pretty wide support in Israel. But this isn't something that can be a left-right issue.
And I think that's
something that's sort of like intelligent and respectable people, are on their side. So I think it's just politically astute that they're using it.
I think that's an important aspect. Before the Constitution was written in South Africa was when I studied law here in 1991, 92. And we had a professor at the time, Professor van der Vyver, and he said to us, when you write a constitution, don't imagine Nelson Mandela as the president of the country. Imagine your worst enemy. because that's the guy or the gal that you have to keep honest. And to some extent, the judicial reform that's happening at the moment, alongside with a Ben Gvir and a Smotrich, who do strike fear into many of us, we actually can imagine maybe our not our worst enemy, because I think that's a bit dramatic for that as well. But we can imagine a group of people who, in fact, don't align, let's say, with some of what we think is the way to go. So that as a combination, I wonder if that isn't the reason that we've got this pushback in Israel. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's also an element of it. Ben Gvir being in this government, being a minister, it's sort of unprecedented that someone that extreme is a minister in Israel. And, there's people make the argument, right, that Ariel Sharon was called a war criminal, and Avigdor Lieberman, Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State when Lieberman was foreign minister, she refused to meet with him because people called him a fascist and a racist. And so people are just like, it'll be fine. And I think, I've written about those arguments, and I wrote those arguments in the sense that Israel will be fine. I don't think Israel will suffer undue consequences, specifically of Ben Gvir being a minister. That being said, you can't fool Israelis, and I'm not going to use those arguments in this way either. Like, Ben Gvir is more extreme than any of those people. He just is. He comes from a more extreme background. He pushes for more extreme, or he advocated for more extreme positions. He's not necessarily doing that right now, actively in this government, right? But when you know someone's background, you know his potential.
Yeah, we did have an example over the last few days when Netanyahu meets and they talk about the Temple Mount, and Ben Gvir says, well, I'm definitely going to be going. Now, just because he can doesn't mean he should. That's the difference, I guess, between a politician who's a little bit sensitive to it and somebody who is deliberately stoking that fire. That's quite unnerving.
I guess. I think with Ben Gvir on the Temple Mount, there's a bit of a it takes two to tango here. When Ben Gvir went to the Temple Mount as minister, he spent 13 minutes there. He followed all the rules for Jewish people. He didn't do anything.
I don't argue that. As I said, just because he can doesn't mean necessarily he should.
Right. No, for sure there are other ministers and other politicians that maybe wouldn't have done it just because of the way it would be looked at. That being said, I think that's what people like about him. There's a growing amount of people in Israel, growing numbers of people in Israel who think that Jews should be able to visit the Temple Mount and should have, something closer to equality. The discrimination is so obvious, right? And so the fact that he's willing to stand up there and say, I'm not going to stand for this, which the truth is he's not even not standing for it, right? Because it's not like he went up to the Temple Mount and prayed. But
he did stay within the confines of the law. He did.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. There was a couple of announcements today as well about companies pulling money out of Israel. Again, it's very hard to know the real reason. It's one thing to say it; it's another thing to really understand it. What's your take on that? So
these companies are Israeli. They're actually run by Israelis, and they're Israelis pulling their operations out of Israel. Microsoft, Google, Facebook, they're still in Israel. And so to me, my read on it is that it's entirely politics. There are some people who run high-tech companies or venture capital funds who are left-wing politicians, and they see this as a way, a form of leverage and a way to pressure the government. That's really how I see that. And we'll see. We'll see moving forward if there's some sort of big wave of people moving out, maybe it'll mean something else. But in terms of business and uncertainty and contracts and things like that, Israel ranks really low right now in the certainty of business contracts in Israel. And part of it is because the court can just doesn't have to just read the text of your contract and say it's according to the text or not. The court can come in and say something's unreasonable and throw your contract away, which is not something that happens in, I mean, maybe it does happen in other countries, but it's certainly not very common. And so the argument that Netanyahu made, and he had a press conference last night, was that actually the judicial reform will make it better to do business in Israel, not worse. And I think that that's a fair argument to make. I don't think that these judicial reforms are, would affect business in any way other than that specific one, and also, it's just like high tech operates in China, in Singapore, these are not countries that have like a more robust democracy than Israel. So right. I mean, to me, I think it's purely political.
Okay, that's an interesting one. The issue of Netanyahu himself and the fact that obviously he was pretty determined to form a government at all costs, perhaps having done so with, in fact, something I was concerned about, I tweeted at the time, was I hope that Netanyahu can control the tiger he's ridden in on. And that still remains a concern for me just observing it. Do you think he can control the tiger that he's ridden in on?
So here's the thing. When the government was first being formed, and there's just all kinds of things talking about gay rights, for example, and he said we won't roll back gay rights. And then there's been all kinds of sort of religious things about making all kinds of things not be able to happen on Shabbat, or allowing gender segregation of certain things. The latest thing was that, in Israel, we have these like springs in nature that people like to hike to and swim in and whatever. And the Haredim wanted to pass a law to allow gender segregated hours in nature, like in nature reserves. And so Netanyahu keeps popping up when these things happen and saying like, no, I'm not going to let it happen. I'm going to block it. But eventually something has to give, right? He has to keep a coalition of different parties together, and he's going to have to say yes to something. And the question is, what is it? And so that's, I think, where the danger lies, that eventually he's going to have to do something, and he is the moderate in this coalition. I know maybe to some people that's strange. I never thought he was a very extreme person. Anyway, he's more moderate than I think his reputation is and has always been. But in this government, he absolutely is the moderate, and he is the person who has to like stand athwart the wave of whatever the more extreme elements of the coalition want to do.
So what you're saying is
so much he can do and keep them together.
So in other words, he's strong enough up to a point. At some point, he has to make some forms of concessions to the coalition.
Right. He's very strong, but it's also a system in which you have to compromise.
Right. Which is of course a difficult one. Let's just talk about the issue of Shabbat, and I see there's some questions on that as well. How contentious an issue is this?
It's an interesting issue. People really want public transportation on Shabbat. That's like the big one. A lot of people who can't afford, cars, or, don't want to be driving, and so the last government tried to push it forward, and it didn't happen. And then the Haredim really, really, really oppose it. And these days, Netanyahu is very dependent on the Haredim. So, it's not going to happen. But there's an attempt by the Haredim and even now some elements in Likud to make even, to sort of change the status in the sense that like more things will be stopped on Shabbat. There was like a sort of a red herring this week that people might have heard of about cultural events. Basically, in the last government, the culture minister decided to start this whole thing where there would be all kinds of cultural events on Shabbat. And the current cultural minister said that like the state of Israel symbolically never sponsored events on Shabbat in the past, and like he doesn't think that Israel should do that. Like as a Jewish state, we shouldn't start sponsoring events on Shabbat. And so there's like he changed it so that basically there's like cultural funding to the municipalities, and then each municipality use its discretion on how it wants, whether it's on Shabbat or not. But instead, there was this huge media blow up of like, they're banning events on Shabbat. So if that's something people heard this week, it's not what's actually happening. But it doesn't mean that the Haredi parties still push for these kinds of things. They still try to sort of test the limits of what will be acceptable. And the thing is that most Likud voters don't want, more things to be closed on Shabbat. They still want to have soccer games on Shabbat. It's like the average, if I were to put the religious level of the average Israeli, I would put it at like they have Friday night dinner with their family where they say Kiddush and they say Hamotzi, but then after dinner, they'll watch a soccer game on TV. That would probably be the religious average in Israel.
So that's an interesting question, because where does the average Likud supporter stand with this? Because they are now the sort of the center or the most moderate of the coalition. There must be certain things that they're comfortable with and certain things they're uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different sort of populations that vote for Likud. Likud has well over 100,000 members. And those are just the paying members. The voters, it's more than 1 million. And the thing is, the stereotypical Likud voter is someone who's Sephardic, whose family came from the Middle East or North Africa to Israel, and is traditional, sort of believes in God, maybe goes to synagogue every week, or maybe goes to synagogue only occasionally, but like has a very strong, like, sense of Jewishness and feeling about it, and will probably in all likelihood light candles and say Kiddush with their family every week. Again, even if they're watching the soccer game after, even if they're driving to their parents' house for that meal, etc. And in the 90s, Netanyahu had a poll like a pollster in his campaigns named Arthur Finkelstein. He's since passed away, but he took a really interesting poll that showed that the Israeli right wing sees itself as Jewish before Israeli, and the Israeli left wing sees itself as Israeli before Jewish. And that's something, and that's something that's really sort of colored the way Netanyahu and Likud has campaigns about a lot of things.
Oh, interesting.
At the time, there was a bumper sticker. Back in the 90s, there was a bumper sticker that said Netanyahu is good for the Jews. So that tells you a lot.
Amazing. That's very, very, in fact, that kind of thing sticks as well, because and I think that's to some extent how South African Jews generally try and determine this. Just as an observer from a little bit more of a distance, the concern for me is the importing of the American style of, and I don't want to say the word extremism, but lack of nuance into politics, where something is all good and all bad, and it's a horror or it's wonderful. But there's actually, but nuance is missing. In other words, maybe some judicial reform is important, but not to the extent that it compromises the rights of other people. Where's nuance gone? Does it still exist, and it's just the media portraying it, or is Israeli society and politics in danger of losing something that is actually really about critical thinking, the ability to think critically?
So I think there's like a wave going on in a lot of the Western world, but not only, of like populism on the right. Now, populism isn't necessarily bad, although it's not very nuanced to speak to your question. But in Israel, it's dovetailed with a long lasting, like a long continuing rise of the right wing. I mean, the trend has been for the past 20 years or so that the right wing has been rising. Labor has all but disappeared from the map, and so Meretz has disappeared from the Knesset. And now you can't win an election from the left. You can win from the center, even though the right, we see Netanyahu is more likely to win anyway. So these two things have sort of come together. But I agree that there is an issue. It's not just a nuance thing. It's that in the US, it's a two-party system, and in Israel, sometimes they behave like it's a two-party system, one party being the Bibi party and the other party being the anyone but Bibi party, right? And there are a lot of frustrating things about Israel's multi-party system. For example, how unstable the coalitions are and how often we have elections. But there is something to a multi-party system in that it requires compromise, because you don't just have one party and sort of one leader making all the decisions.
Which can be good unless you've got a
compromise
kingmaker who's at Ben Gvir, in
Right.
which case they become the more powerful element in the
Right.
government.
No, so we talked about that's the negative element of the
Yes,
multi-party system, but another negative element. But there is something positive, I think, to having to compromise, because then you do have to get into the nuances, right? You can't just ram things through.
Right.
But when things sort of boil down to this, like BB block, not BB block, you do lose some element of that.
Right. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, please don't be shy. Put them in the comments, and we will certainly try and get to them. Aryeh Deri's statement that he almost is in defiance of the Supreme Court and he'll be back in office. What happens if there is this reform, if he decides not to listen to the Supreme Court? Now, it didn't happen. He was removed. The Supreme Court made the decision and he was removed. But again, this is something that the language around this is quite concerning.
Yeah, I mean, look, with Shas and Aryeh Deri, it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, anyone familiar with Aryeh Deri knows that he served time in prison for accepting bribes, or something he was convicted of in the 1990s. And even back then, his supporters set up a sort of makeshift yeshiva outside the prison called Shagat Aryeh, the lion's roar, because Aryeh means lion. And there was a popular song at the time about Aryeh Deri, and the chorus of the song was, "He's innocent, he's innocent." So, Deri has always been able to like nurture this sort of cult of personality, and definitely don't have a lot of respect for the court vis-a-vis, these cases. So it's not new in that sense. I think what's new is, or at least what's new since he went to prison in the year 2000, is that, there's anger on the right about the judiciary and wanting to change things in the judiciary. So he now has support outside of Shas for his sort of anti-court sentiment.
Right. And the impact of this on the law of return, tell us where that stands.
So, in Israel, we have the law of return, which basically says that if you have at least one Jewish grandparent, you have the right to immigrate to Israel. And it could be that it's a paternal grandfather, which means that like for 2 generations, no one's been Jewish according to halacha, right? And so these people are allowed to immigrate to Israel, but when they immigrate to Israel, they're not considered Jewish for purposes of marriage and other life cycle things. The rabbinate doesn't recognize them as Jewish. There's been a rise, especially, and again, this is also something that's been going on for, 15, 20 years, that the largest groups who immigrate to Israel are generally from the former Soviet Union. And we've gotten to a point where the majority of those coming to Israel are not Jewish according to Jewish law. And most of them will freely admit that they're not Jewish, but they have a Jewish grandparent. They have a right to come, according to Israeli law. Some people are critical about that. They're worried. They're saying we shouldn't have to worry about intermarriage in the Jewish state, for example. We shouldn't have to worry about losing our Jewish majority because we're importing people who are not Jewish. On the other hand, you have the Reform movement, which is the largest denomination in the U.S., which is of course the largest diaspora, makes up half the diaspora or more, and they go by patrilineal and matrilineal descent. So you have a lot of people out there who are not Jewish according to the Israeli rabbinate or according to Orthodox law, but they view themselves as Jewish. They view themselves as part of a Jewish community. They might even be supporters of Israel. So in Israel, it's not as big a story as it is outside of Israel. I don't think that it's not a priority either. It's not like something that I think that they're going to be pushing next week. It's a discussion. It's like I said, it's not top of the agenda. For diaspora Jews, almost every group I speak to is very worried about this, and I had a group recently that was in Israel that I was speaking to. And one of the women said to me that was like, if Israel won't accept my grandchildren and recognize them as Jewish, like I feel like Israel's rejecting me, and I can understand people feeling that way. So I'm not entirely sure where this is going to go, because I think that Netanyahu understands the feelings of the diaspora. But again, I still don't know where's that place where Netanyahu is not going to be able to say no anymore.
And of course, the whole the reform movement as well. There's definitely been some form of distancing between diaspora Jewry and Israel over the last while, and I think that COVID added to that. In truth, when Israel shut its borders and said that if you're Israeli, you can come back into Israel. If you're not, well then you can't. So I think that was and whether it was the right decision or not is a separate issue. But it certainly, on some level, sent the message to diaspora Jewry that you Jews, you're not Israeli. There is a bit of a difference, and I think that might have continued now to some extent with this feeling around the difference between, or the chasm between, diaspora Jewry and Jews of Israel. What's your sense of that?
Well, I think I think that in the United States specifically, Jews are much more to the left than in Israel. I had talked about how the right in Israel is growing, and Israel is one of the few countries in the Western world where young people are more right-wing than the older people. So this trend looks like it's going to continue. And it's the exact opposite of what's happening in the United States. I'm not the politics in South Africa are so different that it's hard for me to really compare what's going on, to make that same comparison. But, and I think that just has a lot to do with it, that people who their sort of left-wing politics, and we know that the further you get to the left, they become very anti-Israel in, I don't know, really the past 50 years. That's like a bigger part for people for whom their politics are a bigger identity than being Jewish and their connection to Israel. So then they're not so interested in a strong connection with Israel anymore, or they're even highly critical of Israel. And I think that that's the main issue. To me, it's like, I don't know, the COVID thing. I know that there were some very, very strong reactions in South Africa, including from the chief rabbi, who wrote some, I don't remember if it was an interview or if he wrote something, but it was in the Jerusalem Post, in my paper. And I can understand people feeling hurt. But I think maybe, if there was some sort of war or refugee situation, then things would be, Israel would probably consider things differently. Whereas they said, this is the temporary health lockdown. It's unfortunate if people still feel that way.
Well, it wasn't that I was suggesting that people do. It's just it almost was. It might have been a thought that was developed, or that a realization at the time, and so it continues. Quite a few questions.
Yeah, I think also like that connects to like a lot of times there are issues that diaspora Jews care about that have to do with Israel, that Israelis don't care so much about.
Right, which makes sense, because we're living in different realities. So, so I mean that it does make sense that there are a few questions.
But then you feel that. Sorry, I just want to finish the thought that you sometimes feel that separation because then the government doesn't address, or just barely addresses, these concerns of diaspora Jews. And in the end, it's because there's no constituency in Israel for them, and politicians are politicians. They want people to vote for them. They want to do things for their voters. And so that's like another place where I feel a separation. So like specifically in the issue of like the Western Wall, again, when I talk to American Jewish organizations, they're very into the egalitarian section of the Western Wall. Whereas in Israel, if it's not a tourist season, that area is practically empty most of the time, because it just doesn't have a constituency in Israel.
Right. It's so interesting. And a lot of that, I would imagine, is also American style, not necessarily South African. I think we're kind of, we're not quite the same there. A couple of questions around the nature of Bibi's charges, and the fact that this is what is motivating him potentially to carry out these reforms. Your thoughts?
So the issues with Netanyahu's case, like I don't think they would be impacted so much by the judicial reform, because those are criminal cases, and the judicial reform has a lot more to do with sort of, I hate to use the word constitutional because there's no constitution, but that's like really what it is, the core of it, constitutional issues, and judicial selection. One could say maybe a more conservative judge would favor Netanyahu more, but even if you change that selection process, it'll take years until you really change the makeup of the court. So I really don't think that this will change very much. With Netanyahu's case, though, I think it has strengthened the sort of anti-court sentiment or the anti sort of legal establishment sentiment, but it's not only like Netanyahu is accused of corruption, and the accusations they sort of vary in their severity. I'm not going to get into it because it takes a really long time, but the law enforcement on this case, the officials have messed up in a lot of ways too. In putting undue pressure on witnesses, in bringing up charges that really have fallen apart in court. And again, so it depends which case. But I think that people who are really paying attention to the court have seen that there's like a level of like negligence in how this case was taken care of, that, even if you don't believe that it's true, it lends some level of credence to sort of, they found their target, Netanyahu, and then they drew the bullseye around it. That's like a lot of Netanyahu supporters feel that way. If I don't think that's true necessarily, but I think that they should have had a really airtight case, and they didn't.
Right. Ben Gvir, this is one of the questions, is seen as a bit of a bomb thrower in the coalition, but what do you think of Smotrich? And we haven't really spoken much about him tonight. Give us a sense of who he is. Is he the person that the media is constructing?
I would say yes and no. The answer is mixed. I think Smotrich is
what we call nuance.
Yes, exactly. He is in many ways just a classic Orthodox Israeli politician. In recent decades, again, that has meant, and I'm talking about Orthodox religious Zionists, it's not Haredi. That has meant very, very robust support for the communities in Judea and Samaria, which I will now call them, if I need to mention them again, I'm going to call them settlements because it's a lot shorter. So people sometimes don't like that term. But he very, very strong support to the extent that that's like that leads his agenda. And that's been true of his sort of political camp for decades now. But also socially conservative. I mean, you go to the Orthodox school system or even Bnei Akiva in Israel, and it's very socially conservative, even compared to some of the like more like modern Orthodox communities in the diaspora that I'm familiar with, at least. And Bnei Akiva in the diaspora is less socially conservative. And just to give an example, Bnei Akiva being the leading Orthodox youth group in Israel. That's like, it's typical, and it's sort of like people are just paying attention now, like they didn't realize that. But in other ways, he is willing to sort of push back or push these issues in a way that other politicians weren't. So it's, to me, for the most part, it's not necessarily his positions that are extreme in a new way or anything. It's sort of his willingness to get up and say, to say like, I'm not embarrassed, or I'm not going to try to be like anybody's sort of like number two or subordinate like my views to those of Likud and of Netanyahu. Naftali Bennett said that too, but I think like Naftali Bennett at heart was more, and I mean, we saw it because we saw what government he was in the last year and a half. He was more of a liberal at heart, whereas Smotrich is not. He's just not.
Right.
Yeah.
We just a final question, because I think we are running out of time. Is I've certainly come under fire quite a lot for making comments about Israel or criticizing Israel. I'm generally, I come under fire for different reasons. When I'm supportive of Israel, of course, that's from South Africa. But often when Jews outside of Israel in the diaspora criticize, we told to kind of know our place. What's your thought on that? Should we be having these discussions? Should Jews outside of Israel have a view as to what goes on in Israeli politics, or should we mind our own business until we come to live there?
I think that when you care about something, you're going to have opinions about it. And I think that that's fine, like for people to be having these discussions and to be having opinions about it. I think that and a lot of Israelis will resent it anyway, but I think that that's not fair of them, because I think a lot of it, the way how passionate diaspora Jews are about Israel reflects like their strong connection. That being said, I think that it's always important to put the criticism like in the right context, like it's sometimes people care so much about Israel that they become hypercritical because they're like so disappointed. And Israel is a country. It's not like a magical place, and so like people often sort of forget to recognize that the politics are the dirty politics you have in other places, and a lot of the trends you see in the world are trends that happen in Israel too. I was talking about sort of right-wing populism, for example, and so I think that there's that. I think that sometimes Jewish criticism of Israel plays into like what seems like Israel getting undue attention for its faults that many other countries in the world have similar faults.
I think that is a great answer. And that's really where we leave it. Lahav Harkov, thank you for giving us the time, for taking us through what is quite a complex situation, but giving it context and giving it a little bit of perspective, which I know has helped me, and I really believe will have helped people on the session. So thank you for taking the time. Stacey, if I can come back to you.
Thank you so much, Lahav and Howard, for that very insightful discussion and for answering some very difficult questions. I think we've all learned so much about what's next for Israel. As Rowan mentioned earlier, this is a very special year. Not only is it Israel's 75th anniversary, which we'll be celebrating in April with you all, but it's also the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, and the South African Zionist Fed is celebrating its 125th anniversary, and we'll be having our conference, which only takes place every 4 years, in August this year. So we look forward to seeing you all at our upcoming events. The next one is actually in February, where Shah Abramson, who is cantor for the State of Israel, will be performing in Israel. So please keep in touch by visiting our Facebook page and our website, which is sazf.org. This recording will also be uploaded. So for those that have missed, it will be available. And finally, just thank you so much for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you all so much. I will be ending the webinar in about 5 minutes. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Lahav. Thank you, Howard. And
thank you, guys.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lahav. Ciao, ciao. Bye.